Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kipping. I'm the Director for Medical Technologies at Element Materials Technology. But previously, I had 4 years at Innovate UK, a couple of years at MHRA in the Medical Devices Division, looking after safety and surveillance. And I've also spent 10 years in industry, in the medical device industry, largely working with cardiology products, cardiac rhythm management. Also did my research in orthopedics. So I've had the privilege of working in healthcare technologies from lots of different angles during my career. So at Element, what we're trying to do is sort of proactively help innovators to make their products as safe as practically possible. And that's something that we're incredibly passionate about, especially having worked at MHRA when we've had to reactively deal with situations involving medical devices. So just to set the scene, appropriate regulation seeks to protect the weak and vulnerable. That's a sort of a consistent theme across regulation in any sector. And it makes illegal, which would otherwise be legal. So to set sort of requirements and processes in place that manufacturers and businesses have to comply with. Now, it is a balancing act, regulation, and there's often a misconception that increasing regulatory requirements results in safer products. At one end of the spectrum, so on the left, if we have none or minimal regulatory requirements, then clearly that's a safety risk to patients and users, because there isn't necessarily that evidence and that consistency in gathering the evidence to demonstrate that they're safe and perform as intended. But at the other end of the spectrum, where you have very stringent regulatory environments or poor support structures to navigate those that environment, that can also lead to increased patient safety risk, because it can stifle innovation, it can reduce access to products. So it's a very fine balancing act. Again, this is just a sort of couple of examples. So back in the 60s, there was the thalidomide scandal, which then led to the MHRA being set up, or well, the medicine side being set up. And then in the late sort of end of 2009, there was the PIP scandal involving breast implants, which led to kind of a strengthening of medical device regulation. And what we typically see is when there's some sort of scandal involving a medicine or a medical device or another product, it could be cars, it could be something else. Typically, we see increased regulatory requirements. And what that can do is, as I said, that can then indirectly impact negatively on patient safety. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about that in a wee while. So very briefly, if we look at sort of the market for medicines and for medical devices, medicines is sort of dominated by big pharma. It's very expensive and time consuming to take a medicine to market. It can take up to 10 years, can cost hundreds of millions of pounds. So typically innovators aim to try and get their innovation to sort of a phase 2 clinical trial, because it's at that point that it gets really expensive when you move into phase 3 clinical trials. So typically they get to that point and then license to big pharma. It's well-trodden regulatory market access routes, not easy, but well-trodden. And again, in terms of that market access to new innovative products, there are schemes like ILAP, and the fact that a lot of medicines are prescribed on a person-by-person basis does have benefits in terms of introducing new products. If we look at medical technologies, most of the businesses, 93%, are small or medium-sized enterprises, so small businesses. Although that said, the top 50 medical device companies dominate in terms of revenue. So what this says is that there's lots of innovators, but typically the products they develop and bring to market aren't necessarily interesting for big medtech to come and sort of purchase. So they have good revenues, but can't be scaled into sort of 10 times or 100 times or whatever. It can be quite tortuous regulatory market access routes, and sort of procurement can be pretty challenging in terms of sort of the adoption of innovation, particularly where there's a requirement to change clinical pathways or introduce a new pathway or approach to clinical need. Looking broadly at how medicines and medical devices are regulated, so medicines in the UK and in the EU, the regulator, so the European Medicines Agency, has overall control from pre-market, the licensing of a medicine, and then the post-market. So it's a bilateral relationship between the manufacturer and the regulator. And that's the same for the US as well with FDA. But for medical devices, we have three-party system. So in the pre-market space, if you want to do a first in-person clinical trial before you have a UK CA mark or a CE mark, then you'd have to apply to do that trial with the kind of the local regulator. So that would be MHRA in the UK, or might be HPRA in Ireland, for instance. When you get to the point where you do the CE marking process or the UK CA process, that process is undertaken, that conformity assessment process is undertaken by a business. And that business for the EU is called a notified body. So the likes of BSI, TÜV-SÜD, SGS, or for UK, it's called a UK approved body. So it's effectively the same thing, but kind of undertaking that conformity assessment process for those two different markets. And then once products are on the market, then the regulator comes in again, and it's MHRA's responsibility for vigilance market surveillance, for instance. So again, even in the way that these types of products are sort of regulated is a bit more sort of confused for medical devices. And that becomes particularly challenging when you have combination products, so a product that perhaps has a medical device component and also a medicinal component. So as it stands in the UK at the moment, and it's not really the UK, it's to get even more complicated, it's Great Britain. Great Britain are using the UK CA mark because Northern Ireland are still working under CE marking regime. Because we left the EU when we did, the new regulations for the EU, so the Medical Device Regulation 2017, 745 and 746, hadn't been implemented in the UK at the time we left the EU. So that means we're still working under the old sort of regulatory regimes, the old directives, whilst the EU is now working under these two new regulations. In terms of the number of medical devices, we don't honestly know. No one knows for certain how many unique medical devices are in the market. It's upwards of 500,000 though. If you include digital in there, it's probably more like 1 million. So there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of medical devices in the market, and it's a very heterogeneous market. So on the right just gives you a sense of sort of the broad range of products that are available, and every product has a slightly different need in terms of its evidence generation and what it needs to demonstrate for conformity assessment. So there isn't a cookie cutter approach in terms of sort of regulatory processes for these devices. In terms of market, US is the biggest market for medical devices by quite some way, then EU, then China, Japan, UK, and rest of the world. So this is why commonly businesses will look at US market and look at CE market as their sort of primary go-to markets. Historically, 2/3 of businesses would go EU first, would get CE mark first, and then look to the US, but that's switched. So now probably upwards of 2/3 of businesses go US first. And that's largely in part to the challenges around the regulatory system in the EU at the moment. But the key thing here is that those are typically the two markets people look at. And again, this just demonstrates that sort of Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland still working under CE mark, Great Britain working under UK CA. So having a sense of the regulatory pathway, but also the market potential at the end of that pathway kind of need to be considered in combination. So some practical considerations. So the key thing from today is for you to go away and understand that regulatory pathways, it's really important for you to understand that the area is important, that you need to think about it. If you have an idea that you want to commercialize, the earlier you think about it and get in place those foundational elements, the better. Because if you don't understand regulatory pathways, you don't understand the evidence requirements, you don't understand timelines, you don't understand the clinical requirements, and you don't understand cost. So when you go to an investor or a grant funder asking for cash, you're not credible. Sorry to be so blunt about it, but that's the situation. So at an early stage, you don't need to understand all of this. You just need to understand, what is your product? What class of product would, is it likely to be? Broadly speaking, what are the kind of evidence requirements you need? You don't need the detail at an early stage. You just need to understand those key building blocks. And there's plenty of organizations out there that can support you and offer you advice. Okay, so don't feel you need to do this on your own, because it can be pretty intimidating. These are broadly the steps that you need to sort of go through when evaluating your device and sort of going through the R&D and then conformity assessment process. I'm just going to give you some sort of practical insights. So the first step is to understand, well, what is your product? So is it a medicine? Is it a medical device? Is it a combination product? Is it a consumer product? Is it something else? So in this example, we've got 3 pictures of glasses. All the glasses are identical. Technically, they are identical. There is nothing between them. And usually I make this bit interactive, so you're lucky that I'm not here today pointing at people and asking you to join in, okay? But I'll put up 3 claims here, okay? So the glasses themselves identical, but the claims that have been made are different. So what I'd usually do is say, well, which one here is the medical? Are they all medical devices and none of the medical devices? What are they? So the first example is not a medical device because there are no medical claims there. They're just reading glasses. The second one, again, it's making a claim about reflecting light, but there's no medical claim related to that. If they said, it reflects light and therefore it has this positive impact on, it sort of reduces the degeneration of your cornea or something, fine, that's a medical claim, but this is just saying it reflects light, so whatever. The last one is a medical device because it makes a specific claim. So it's, plus 1.5 is a medical prescription. So that is a medical device. Another one would be, if I said these glasses protect my eyes from flying shards, then that would be PPE. So that would be personal protective equipment. So what you say the product can do largely dictates which regulatory pathway you go down. Doesn't always, there are some technical sort of parameters that will also send you down pathways as well. But what the claims you made and the intended purpose is really crucial. So looking at graphene, it can be used. So graphene in itself is neither a medical device or a medicinal component, or because there's no intended purpose associated with it. As soon as you process it in some way and then attach claims to it and intend to put it into the market, then you have to consider what those pathways look like. So I know there are going to be some speakers kind of later on talking about drug delivery, combination products and electrodes. So I just thought I'd use these as examples. So if you use graphene to fabricate some electrodes, maybe for a pacemaker lead or deep brain stimulation or whatever it might be, then the graphene isn't the medical device, it's the overall product that's been fabricated that is the medical device. And we'll have to go through assessment based on that. So there will be some specific testing that will need to be done to look at the materials themselves, but you look at the product as an overall entity. The same with, if you use it in wound management. Graphene oxide used for drug delivery, that would be a combination product. And I know there's a speaker next and that's going to talk about combination products, but there, you would have to look at the characterization of the oxide itself, in terms of morphology and interaction with the body, and also look at the drug delivery component as well. So for those three examples, there would be different sort of regulatory pathways. I won't go through this. Basically, if what you want to develop falls into this definition of a medical device, then you're a medical device. You may also fall into, for a combination product, you may fall into a medical device definition and a medicinal definition, and therefore typically the medicines regulatory pathway takes precedence. But fundamentally, if what you're developing sort of falls under this definition, then you're a medical device. And once you know you're a medical device, then you need to understand what classification you are. So you can either go through the regulation and just read through it yourself, or there's a nice website called RegMetrics that will do it for you. So it's basically just a big decision tree, and you put in, what your device is, what it will do. It'll look at the risk classification. It'll look at which parts of the regulation apply to your device. It'll even identify the standards that could potentially be used to demonstrate conformity, and which testing companies are certified to test your device. It's free to use at the moment, and certainly suggest, if you're going down this path or you're thinking about commercializing at the moment, definitely worth having a look. So using the electrode example again, so say we were using it for, to graphene to create fabricate an electrode for the central nervous system. So that would fall under, well, be Rule 8, implantable device. It'd also be Rule 9, so an active therapeutic device. May also be some other things, but you go through this and tick off all of the classification points, that all the rules that apply to your product. So if we look at Rule 8 in a bit more detail, so here we are. It's saying it's class 3. Well, it's not a huge surprise, not a huge surprise that. So just going through that very simple decision tree tells you, broadly speaking, what sort of class your device is. If we look at Rule 9, again, you sort of class 3. If one had said class 2A or 2B and one had said class 3, you always take the higher class. So as soon as you've got class 3 there, you're always going to be class 3, effectively. So what does that tell me? So why is that important? So as soon as I know it's class 3, you're going to need a notified body and a UK approved body if you want to go for EU and UK. You're not going to be able to use, in the days of the directives, you used to be able to use something called a predicate route or claim equivalence. So you used to be able to say, well, my electrode is a bit like the electrode manufactured by this other company. So therefore, we don't need to do this testing, or we don't need to do this clinical trial because we can leverage the evidence that they generated. Technically, you can still claim equivalence, but to do so, that business that you want to claim equivalence with have to agree to that and have to share their technical file with you, so that you then have the evidence to provide to your notified body. And that's never going to happen. No business is going to do that. So it means that businesses have to create their own evidence, which was a key driver behind the changes in the regulations. So that's entirely understandable. Also, so if you're having to generate your own evidence, that's going to probably cost you £1 million plus, probably a lot more than that. But just to give you a quick sense, so typically it's about 10 grand a patient for a clinical trial, and it could take you a year, 2 years to carry that out. After, to design the trial, undertake it, evaluate the results. It's also going to take you 2 years to undergo a notified body CE marking process. So that's once you've got all your evidence. To go through that process at the moment is taking about 2 years. Could take you 6 months just to get onto the waiting list for a notified body at the moment, because there's such a shortage. And the cost of compliance has gone up. So it's about 100K just for that technical file evaluation. possibly a bit more depending on the complexity. So then the question is, so what? So it's crucial to understand the key aspects of the regulatory pathway. So just understanding, is my product a medical device? Is it a medicine? What class is it? Has now enabled me to understand, broadly speaking, how long it's going to take to gather the evidence needed and to go through a conformity assessment process. So I know it's going to take me at least 3 to 4 years after I've done all the preclinical testing to actually go through that process. I know that it's going to cost me £1.5 million plus to do the clinical trial and that CE marking process. So knowing that means that I can then look at the business opportunity. So if you're saying, well, I'm going to be targeting the EU market, well, does the opportunity in that market to generate revenues and profit, does that outweigh the cost of compliance? So is it worth you doing it? Basically, is essentially what we're talking about here. Is it actually worth the effort of developing this product and taking it to market? Or do you look somewhere else? And part of the reason for businesses looking to US is that the route to the regulatory pathway is a lot better understood. There's a lot more clarity there. You can still use a predicate route as well. You can use a sort of 510K route. And you had this massive market at the end. So that's why we've seen this massive shift of people looking at US first. The other thing is that when you, as I said earlier, when you come to pitch for investment, you need that realistic view on timelines and costs. Absolutely essential. And certainly during my time at Innovate UK, working with 500 plus businesses, I saw a handful that understood this, that even understood the basics of this. So if you're able to get those foundations in place, and it doesn't need to cost you anything, or it doesn't need to cost you a lot to do that, but if you get those foundations in place, alongside understanding your IP position, freedom to operate, understanding your market and all the other factors, then you're in a much better place. Sort of you're at a competitive advantage over every other startup that's pitching for cash. So I can't stress enough how important it is to sort of think about the regulatory pathway and just get those foundational building blocks in place. Again, I won't go through all of this, but there's lots of changes to the European medical device regulation. The UK is going through a process of updating its own legislation. So MHRA published a consultation on medical device regulation last Sunday. Broadly speaking, we're going to be aligning pretty closely with the EU. And the executive summary is that there's much more emphasis in terms of businesses gathering evidence pre-market and post-market. There are some new requirements on notified bodies, which has led to about half the notified bodies sort of walking away. So we had about 55, we've now got 30, which has led to a bit of a challenge in terms of capacity. And a lot of these changes make sense. Using unique device identifiers, barcoding makes absolute sense. So you can, manage stock, manage recalls, understand where products are in the supply chain a lot easier. So a lot of these things make a lot of sense, but the problem is that it has raised the cost of compliance for businesses that have products in the market or innovators coming to market. And what we're expecting is to see around 20% of the markets, 20% of the products disappear from the market in UK and EU over the coming sort of 4 or 5 years. So just some other areas to sort of think about in terms of identifying risks. There's a standard ISO 14971 that's harmonized and used by FDA and within the EU. So that's a really good one to work towards. Again, in terms of quality management systems, ISO 13485 is the quality management system to use for medical devices. So it's important to have a quality management system in place so that you can demonstrate that the manner in which you've undertaken the design process, but also the manner in which you've collected evidence has been done in a consistent way that meets those sort of quality requirements. So that one was just to give you a sense of sort of the actual sort of user and clinical validation piece. So it isn't just around doing a clinical trial on your product. It's important that you undertake a literature survey, look at the methodology within that, look at other clinical investigations, look at adverse incident databases if that's applicable. So the FDA have something called the MORD database, which has all their adverse incidents involving medical devices. So it's looking at all data sources that are relevant to the product you're developing, and then building an appropriate clinical evaluation plan and report around that. This just it gives you a sense of what a process looks like for different classifications of products. Basically, if you're class 1, it's self-certification for EU and for the UK. What that means is that you go online and you self-certify and say, I am compliant to the regulations. Costs about 200 quid. You can do it in a few days, dead easy. You need to have all the documentation in place, but really simple process. If you're anything other than class 1, you're looking at about 2 years to go through a notified body process at the moment, and looking at 100k is the executive summary of this. There are different, again, levels of scrutiny as you got that classification process as well, as you would expect. Important to stress that the conformity assessment process, when you go for a CE mark, there are 2 bits to it. So the notified body will look at your technical documentation, so your technical file, but you also need to have your quality management system audited. So the 2 are done, I mean, they could be done at this similar time, but typically the quality management system, you want to have that in place minimum 3 months before you go for CE mark or UK CA. Really, you want it in place as soon as you can. And that can be audited whenever you have that set up and running. So you have the ISO 13485 or whatever quality management system you have in place audited. So you get a ticking box for that. And then separately, the technical file documentation and all your clinical evidence is evaluated by a notified body as well. Both of those need to be satisfied, but are done typically at in a staged approach. Again, this just talks about that ISO 13485. Again, you can work outside ISO 13485, but no one does. Because if you work outside it, you have to then prove to a notified body the validity of your approach. It's a lot easier just to work to ISO 13485. You can get a system put in, if you need one putting in, for about 10k, something like that. There's some people locally around Manchester that can sort of help with that as well. Yeah, this just gives a summary of kind of what you'd need to do for UK and the EU. I won't sort of hang around on this slide too much, but it's likely UK will continue to accept CE mark up until 2026, maybe 2028, depending on the type of product. That was just announced in the consultation. So it's like, if I was developing a product, I'd probably look UK, probably look CE mark first. Maybe look at UK CA if you're doing digital, but giving that consideration of which pathway you go down and the costs and the requirements is again the key thing, really. So main thing to stress from today is that it's really important. I know it's daunting, regulation, but thinking about it at an early stage can save you a lot of time, a lot of cash, a lot of heartache, and really help guide your R&D processes. And there are loads of organizations out there that can help you, support you. A lot of them will do that for free or have programs in place that you can pay to access. But get advice, whether that's NIHR, Innovate UK, NICE, AHSNs, whoever it may be. get advice and talk to a range of different organizations. Usually I do a Q&A here, but unfortunately unable to do so today. So I'll leave you on that, and I hope you have a great rest of today and enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you.